Good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 p.m. and it's time for the Special Topics in English Learner Programming monthly webinar. Happy Valentine's Day to you all. This month's webinar is titled Improving Skills in the Four Language Domains, Speaking. So as you can probably guess from the title, we'll be focusing on speaking. I do want to invite you to take a look at your webinar panel. Within the platform, you should be able to download the WIDA standards and levels. It's in Word doc format. It's a document that has some graphics in it that have very small print, and it's very hard to show them on a slide. So I wanted to make those available to you. You should be able to click the link that says WIDA Standards and Levels, download it, print it out if you'd like to, and use it for instructional purposes. My name is Anika Harris. Welcome again to February's monthly webinar. I am the Professional Development Specialist at Aussie, focusing on English language acquisition. And I suppose it's no longer the new year, but Happy New Year to those of you whom I did not greet last month. Every month, the second Thursday at 1 p.m., I present this webinar series. It covers a wide variety of topics related to English learners and their needs, both instructional, administrative, social, emotional. Last month's webinar was the beginning of this four-part series, where I'm talking about a specific language domain within the framework of the WIDA English Language Development Standards. Last month's webinar focused on listening, and I'm building upon that structure to present speaking to you. Specifically, we will address how the speaking domain fits into the broader context of communication. We'll touch on some considerations for designing speaking activities and considerations for assessing English learners in the speaking domain. So just like last month, I want to present to you a case study, a different student. This month, we are going to take a look at Alpha. He's 15 years old and in the 9th grade at ABC Public Charter School. He arrived in this country from the Ivory Coast just this summer. He speaks French and Jura, and his schooling was all done in Burkina Faso, which is both countries, Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso, are in West Africa, sub-Saharan West Africa. Alpha's screener score when he came to ABC Public Charter School was a 2.1, and in speaking, he scored a 1.9. So if you're familiar with how screeners work, you get a composite score, and in his case, his composite score merging all four communication domains was 2.1, but in speaking, his grade for just that domain was a 1.9. All right. In mid-October, Alpha's teachers really just didn't have a high opinion of him. So you, as a teacher who works with English learners, have been brought in by the teachers to observe Alpha in class. And what you notice is that he sits in the back of the class. He doesn't really interact with any of his classmates. And his classmates happen to all be from Latin America. Alpha's not disruptive, but he only speaks when spoken to by the teacher, and it seems like he finishes his assignments quickly. Alpha also happens to have a really heavy accent, but you are able to wade through the accent and you discern that he almost always uses complete sentences. So let's look at Alpha a little more carefully. Remember now, he's 15 and he's been placed in the 9th grade. He is a recent arrival, right? He arrived this summer. and he's completed all his schooling. He didn't skip any classes. Now, even though he's from the Ivory Coast, his schooling was done in another country, in Burkina Faso. So here's what this means. For Alpha, yes, he's from the Ivory Coast, but his family chose to send him north of the Ivory Coast. From his village in the Ivory Coast to neighboring Burkina Faso to attend Catholic school. And it was known by his family that the Catholic school would afford him a well-rounded education. Alpha came to the United States to join his mom and her extended family. And he has cousins around his age in DC. Alpha's screener score in speaking was 1.9. What are some educated guesses that you can make about his education and language background, just based on that limited context? Go ahead and reflect on the text in the slide, and you can use the question or the chat box to answer the question, what are some educated guesses we can make about Alpha's education and language background? All right, you can keep typing in. I know, yes, I have highlighted some facts in the case study for you to contemplate, and there's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, so just reflecting on some of the responses coming in, both the question and the chat box. Yes, he's a newcomer. He's been in the United States less than a year. Okay, you were able to pick up that he can speak in complete sentences, and at the same time, he just received a 1.9 in speaking on his screener, okay? Right, that his village might not have comprehensive schooling, and that might be the reason that his family sent him to Burkina Faso to attend Catholic school. We can infer that, right? We don't have that as a fact, but we can infer it. Thank you for participating there. Let's move along. I mentioned the fact that he took a screener upon entry into ABC Public Charter School, which is common practice for students who have completed the home language survey when they are first enrolling in a DC public school. That's standard practice. And there must have been something on the survey that triggered for him screener of English language proficiency. And he scored a 1.9 in listening. But there are other domains of language beyond listening. So let's talk about what language domains are. There are 4 domains of language, or 4 components of communication. And those are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The brief definition of each domain is presented before you, as stated by WIDA, where listening, which we covered last month, is the process of understanding spoken language, and speaking is the spoken language that people hear. Next month's webinar will focus on reading, and the final part of the series will focus on writing. So we'll save that for a bit. But what I do want to mention, and what will be highlighted, is that all 4 of the domains are interrelated. There is no one domain that's more important than the other. We can further divide language into 2 parts, oral language and literacy, where oral language is listening and speaking, and make the foundation for reading and writing, which are the elements of literacy. When it comes to oral language, it's really often school where oral English skills develop for English learners. Note that listening is the receptive part of oral language. Your ears are receiving sounds and messages that your brain has to process. And speaking is the active part of oral language, where you're moving your mouth and the structures within your mouth and throat and chest in order to make sound and communicate messages that then go into someone else's ear, are received by someone else's ear for them to listen to. WIDA provides a rubric for speaking and understanding how students ascend from one level of proficiency to the next. And the graphic you see in front of you is not the complete rubric. This has been adapted from the Access for ELL's Test Administration Manual, or an older version of it. And I've given for you 3 of the 6 levels. Level 1 being ascribed to students with the most limited ability in English. Level 3 being ascribed to students who are at the intermediate level of proficiency. And level 5, for us here in DC, level 5 is the score they would need to hit on their annual English language proficiency test, the Access for ELLs, to then exit the English learner program. So for us, we consider a level 5 where students are more or less performing in language on par with their native English speaking peers. You'll see in the arrows for level 1 what they can do with language, or the quantity and the complexity, right? Level 1, you're getting a word or words, but not that many words strung together, just enough to make short phrases. Whereas in level 3, the phrases are expanding in length, and student may be producing full sentences. And at level 5, those sentences can be joined together to make more complex discourse. You want to think of somebody on a panel, on a news program, or someone standing up in debate club would be likely using linguistically complex discourse. The next set of arrows at each of the 3 levels give you a sense of what type of vocabulary the student is using. Very common words, like for level 1 students. A little more specific content words, like for level 3 students. And technical words and technical language, and being able to use those technical words with ease, as is known to happen with students at level 5. And the last set of arrows all the way on the right side match up to the comprehensibility and also the complexity of the language being used. Level 1 students, they're just using words likely that they've memorized, that are routine, that they're encountering with frequency. At level 3, where they're experimenting with sentences of varying lengths, where the student does try to make more complex sentences, there may be errors in their attempts as they struggle productively with sounding like their native English-speaking peers and trying to put words in order that sounds like their peers and to put grammar structures in place appropriately as do their native English-speaking peers. And at level 5, you see the last arrow says the errors that they do make, if any, are going to be on par with their native English-speaking peers. You might think of speaking as being the key indicator or key indication of how well a student is doing in their acquisition of English. Let's see if that's really the case. Speaking is important. As I alluded to, all 4 domains of language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing are important, with not one really being more important than the other. It's just that speaking happens to be the area that is production, and you can hear the product that the student is making. So if there is a lot of product, often we think the student is doing just fine and they have acquired English. Here is roughly how speaking develops, and I've divided this into phases. Phase 1 is that newcomer or student with little to no English language speaking ability. They're just hearing the sounds around them. They cannot yet produce English or produce very much spoken English because they haven't heard enough of it to analyze and then synthesize and then produce through speaking. So at phase 1, the student is just hearing the sounds and matching the sounds to actions or matching the sounds to concepts and compartmentalizing what the student hears to retrieve and use at a later time. In phase 2, the student is able to make associations between the sounds and the context that those sounds occur. I know when I was learning languages on my own and not in class, my strategy was just to match the sounds that I heard with the context. And this sounds kind of a little bit nerdy, but I used to carry around a book, and whenever I heard a sound and I felt like I could reliably match it up with the context, I would write that down, and that book became my dictionary. So it is true, and I'm proof of it, that students associate sound with context and make meaning of that sound. Then in phase 3, as the student feels comfortable that they understand what sound goes with what context, they can start to produce the sounds. But even before that, they're discriminating the sounds and understanding that certain sounds go together, and then there's a pause, and then another set of sounds go together. And as they can predict the order in which those sounds come, they make meaning of words, and then they string the words together to form phrases from those sounds. So it goes from being just sounds to sounds with pauses, and then sounds with pauses, to a string of sounds that ultimately become words and phrases. And lastly, the student does produce language. They start speaking because they've heard the sounds, they've associated it with the context, they are able to figure out where the sound starts and the sound finishes to be matched up with that context, and they're feeling comfortable that they can then mimic what they've heard and start speaking. Reading develops in a similar fashion, and we'll talk about that in a couple of months. So it's important to develop a student's speaking skills because speaking represents what the learner is thinking and can say in English. It might not represent what the student is thinking and can say in their first or other languages that are not English, but when we're talking about assessing in the speaking domain, we're listening to what the EL or the English learner can think and say in English. Speaking is one of the ways that we transmit ideas. Writing is the other. And this is how we get to know our students and what they know. Speaking also helps students express their needs and their wants. So frequently, teachers will share with newcomers words and phrases associated with going to the bathroom, getting excused for water or to blow their nose and get a tissue, to go to the nurse. It's that language of survival. But beyond that, once we have the most fundamental survival language, we need to survive in the academic setting. And so speaking is a means of expressing how well we understand content and what we need more of in order to be successful academically. Speaking, as I've mentioned, is one of 4 domains, and they're interrelated. Growth in speaking leads to increased skill in reading and writing. And we'll talk about leveraging the speaking domain to develop content knowledge. I'll share some activities and examples from a content area. I thought this quote was very interesting, that reading and writing float on a sea of talk. So there you see author James Britton also recognized that talking and reading and writing were interrelated. We need to understand how students learn languages because that helps us to know when a child is developing language well or needs an evaluation for a disability. It helps us teachers to create activities to help them progress in language acquisition. And it helps us to assess them and plan for further language development. But remember, receptive input, or listening and speaking alone, doesn't make a language learner fluent. They definitely need opportunities to practice output. And this isn't me saying it. This is a research-based statement. If you are a language learner, you know how important those opportunities are, or else you just can't grow in your output. So some challenges to grow in speaking. First, let's think of the speaker himself or herself. Their prior language knowledge may impede their ability to grow without support, particularly students who don't have cognates in their language to the English language and have a harder time latching on to sounds that are familiar. A student's proficiency in their first language can be a barrier if the student doesn't have an understanding of grammar and an understanding of the order in which words occur. Then it's hard to match that knowledge to what they're learning in the English language. There's also the generation. So here we're talking about if the student is a little bit older, they come with their own set of skills to learn a language, but as is typically known, young children pick up languages faster. They're malleable, their brains are like sponges. What older learners do possess, even though it might take a little longer to grow in speaking, is that they have strategies that they picked up from their years of experience. Someone who is monolingual will have less language learning strategies to attach to learning English versus someone who's already multilingual and has acquired multiple languages, has multiple experiences attaching structures and grammar, vocabulary and cognates to their English learning experience. And clearly motivation, if you're not motivated, it's going to be harder to push yourself to learn And that goes along with personality. Some students are a little more shy and may be a little more reluctant to practice their production or their speaking. Environment can pose a challenge as well. If we're not feeling like experts in a certain subject, we may not want to speak out. If we are not happy, we may not want to speak out. And if we're not feeling well otherwise, due to physiological conditions like hunger or being sick, we may be less interested in speaking. Finally, there can be some challenges that the listener are presented to the listener. So a speaker who's learning English might come with an accent, but bear in mind, having an accent doesn't necessarily mean someone is not does not have fluency in English. So as a listener and as listeners of our students who may have accents, we need to be able to discriminate and separate accent from fluency. Listeners sometimes lack the patience to listen to someone who doesn't speak as proficiently. Again, for us as educators, we need to value the speech of all students, and that might mean, for some of us, practicing wait time for ourselves to be patient and let students say what they need to say. So the heart of this webinar is in supporting students in speaking. We have to reflect on our own practices. We can think about creating multiple opportunities for purposeful student talk within our lessons. And in this graphic, which comes from Douglas Fisher's work, Content Area Conversations, he breaks purposeful student talk into teacher modeling, independent tasks, collaborative tasks, and guided instruction. And there are some descriptions of each of those headers in the graphic. It's helpful to provide models of what teachers would like students to say instead of not providing a model, and then a student has to struggle to figure out if what they're about to put out there for everyone to hear is going to sound right. Teachers can also move students from one level up to a higher level of proficiency by recounting, right, or retelling is a synonym for recounting. And that's sort of on the lower level of proficiency. Students hear something and then they repeat or they recount what they've heard. You can move them up from that to getting them to explain, which requires them to use new words, and then move them even further with time to arguing and being that debater or being that panelist on a news program where they have to use more spontaneous speech and also actively use their listening skills as well. So I've designed some listening activities to give you a sense of what is unique about speaking and how to prepare to develop a student's speaking skill in the classroom setting. We're going to be looking at activities for levels 1, 3, and 5, where 1 is also known as entering, and it's a lower level. Here you see a description for listening. However, knowing that listening and speaking are interrelated, the task is very similar, and that's in pink. In purple, you get a sense of what students can do at that level with their speaking skills. Let's match that back to this activity here. For a level 1 student, someone who's coming with little to no English language skills, one activity could be a homework review or a quiz review. What you see here on the slide is an independent task with teacher modeling, where first the teacher is going to show an answer key after students have completed their homework or even completed a quiz. So the answer key is on the screen for all of the students to see. Students get to check their own work and circle the answers that are not correct. The teacher also presents these question starters. Did you write? Did you write? And the teacher models asking a peer. Did you write yes? And the student says no. The teacher then pretends or a role plays asking another peer. Did you write yes for question 2? And the peer responds yes. Let me explain. So here the teacher is using a peer, likely another student in the classroom, to model checking your work. This teacher finds an incorrect answer on their homework or their quiz, and they go to a peer and ask, did you write yes for question 2, for example? And perhaps a student responds no. They go to another peer and ask, did you write yes for question 2? And the peer says yes. Let me explain. You'll notice here these question prompts, there are only 3 words because we're working with low-level students. And the responses are also short, yes or no. After teacher modeling, the students stand up and they look for classmates who have the correct answer to the first item, and they'll ask their peer using the question frame, did you write? And they'll also rely on the teacher's model to help them remember what to say and how to say it and what types of answers to expect, either a yes or a no. And they'll repeat that for each item of their homework or each item of the quiz. This activity is intentionally bare bones. There's minimal language, but you have to remember what level students we're working with. And the point here is right now less on the content and more on building language skills. So at level 1, we're thinking of just a few words and also yes, no answers. Other activities you can do are Pictionary. Many of us may have played that, or charades, where the teacher is pre-teaching content vocabulary and then engages the students in a game of Pictionary or charades based on those same vocabulary words. Level 1 students should be allowed to use 1, 2, or 3 words for their answer. So you see in the graphic, it looks like the class has studied food or maybe holidays. And one student has gone up to the easel and has drawn a turkey, maybe? Turkey? Oh, yes, a turkey, clearly, because that's the response of the other student. And you see the student who's standing up and responding, turkey, is using just 1 word, which is just fine for a student at level 1. At level 3, remember that students have more vocabulary to work with and they're engaging in this productive struggle as they try to form complete sentences and work through understanding grammar and word order. They may be trying to also insert more content-specific language, but there are still errors. An activity that is appropriate for this level is a collaborative task where we're looking for students to clarify and discuss. So the teacher would pre-teach vocabulary and build background knowledge. Then the teacher would group students according to the answers they give to a prompt such as, Which habitat would you prefer to live in? Use at least 2 of the listed habitat features to explain why. So that's the prompt, and the teacher is grouping students according to their answers. In groups, students have a chance to explain why they prefer to live in that habitat. So in the group, students are questioning each other, which habitat would you prefer to live in? They're giving their answers to their peers, and they're clarifying their positions, or they're justifying and clarifying their positions. This group activity, where the teacher is removed, creates a very safe space for students to experiment with language just among their peers. Next, each group is going to choose the most interesting explanation, and then the chosen students come up to the front of the classroom and form a panel and present their explanation to the class. So why this is appropriate for level 3 is the students have had an opportunity to learn about the vocabulary because the teacher pre-taught vocabulary and built background knowledge. Also, students had an opportunity to practice their spoken language in small groups of their peers before going in front of the class and forming a panel. So there were opportunities to practice with the vocabulary, the content, and with the speech that they were ultimately going to use. To increase the challenge, teachers could just place students in pairs instead of groups, larger groups, and then have the students present a classmate's explanation, right, engaging their listening skills about where they would choose to live in their chosen habitat, including at least 2 reasons, right, increasing the speaking challenge, and including at least 2 habitat features, increasing both the speaking and the content that is expected in the response. So at level 5, we're thinking about students being more or less on par with their native English-speaking peers. And the activity here could be meet the expert. This goes back to guided instruction. And here's the setup. The students have gone through a unit or a project, but they're not quite done yet. So have each student come up with a question he or she knows the correct answer to based on what they studied in the unit or the project. Then the teacher has the students stand in 2 rows facing each other. The students in one row or on one side ask their questions. And this happens all at the same time. It's going to be noisy, and that's fine. It actually blocks out the sound it actually creates more sound so the students feel like other people are not necessarily listening to them, just their row opposite. The students in the other row answer. The teacher can circulate using questions and prompts and cues to help the student expert elaborate and clarify information. Then the answer is moved to the left and repeat the activity. So we're thinking of experts, level 5, students should be able to speak at length on the content, but there's still a safe space to speak because the students are facing their peer, and there are multiple opportunities to speak because they move to the left and repeat the activity. Each time the students repeat what they are an expert in, they have a chance to refine not only their understanding of how they speak, but actually refine their speech, getting better each time. Assessment is very important when developing any of the 4 language domains. This is how we get information about how students are doing, and we reflect and think about what we as teachers can do to move students up to the next level. So let's look at some activities for level 1, those students who are coming to us with little to no English speaking ability. This activity is sometimes known as telephone. And the content here is history. As you see, I'm diving into Greek mythology. So in this lesson, the teacher has pictures representing the Greek gods taught in a Greek mythology lesson. And I've included a picture on this slide here. The teacher shows one picture to one student. Just one student. That student describes the picture using as many words as he or she can to a classmate. The expectation, remember, for a level 1 student is words. So we're not expecting complete sentences. In part 3 of this activity, the classmate that has heard the student's words states the name of the Greek god based on the student's description. This activity should be done after some study of Greek mythology so that the student has built up enough vocabulary to have some words to describe the picture and enough words to share with the classmate so the classmate who has not seen the picture can understand what's being said and can connect those words to a Greek god. Level 3, we have students producing more language. They're able to speak in simple and somewhat expanded sentences with content, but there are still going to be errors. This activity is known as a zip report, where the teacher assigns each student a figure from Greek mythology. And in the picture, you see a figure from Greek mythology. The teacher provides the student with the visual for their respective figure. Then the teacher allows 5 minutes for each student on their own to jot down notes about the figure they've been assigned. Here you see we have some support, and that support is the visual. So the student can look at the picture, jot down what they see, and hopefully the picture will help stimulate their memory about what they've studied so they can also jot down more content-related words. Then each student has 2 minutes to say in sentences as much as they can about their figure in front of the class. So a teacher who is doing this activity might circulate to listen in and make sure that the English learner who's at level 3 is speaking in sentences, and maybe if not, the teacher will want to cue or prompt the student to use complete sentences. So let's go back to level 1. And pardon me for taking you back here. Level 1 was telephone, where we were asking the student to use words. If the student, after having gone through the lesson, has no words, and you've been a supportive teacher to this student, supportive in terms of helping to develop the English language, then this student may not have enough words and is still struggling just with the language, not necessarily the content, but just with the language, and may need your support through instructional strategies, or maybe changing up the methodology, or maybe co-planning with the English learner specialist to think about ways to help the student to develop words to be able to complete this activity. But you would then assess whether the student had enough words to help their classmate describe, name the Greek god, and know whether or not your student was ready to move up to a level 2 or even 3, or if they're still at 1 and needed support. With the level 3 activity zip report, where we're asking students to speak in sentences, if a student is still struggling just with coming up with a complete sentence and they are, on the contrary, giving you words or short phrases, then you know that student is still struggling and not yet ready to move up to the next level, and will need your support or your co-planning with the English learners specialist to think about how to help the student know how to form sentences that sound right to him or her and be able to spontaneously create sentences. With our level 5 students who are about to exit or may have just exited the English Learner Program, an activity is known as role play. And in role play, the teacher designates a current event as a theme. So I came up with the example of the Anak Krakatau volcano that caused a tsunami in Indonesia in December, not that long ago. That's the current event. Then the teacher assigns each student a figure from Greek mythology. The teacher gives each student time to brainstorm how their assigned figure from Greek mythology would explain the cause of the event. So the language goal here is to be able to explain. Notice that I've matched explain as the language demand to level 5, knowing that explaining is going to take more content vocabulary, more words in general, and extended and more complex discourse. So a string of sentences that weave the content throughout in order to justify their position. The teacher will call on 2 students to come forth and discuss and or debate the issue of the character, being sure to defend their positions. So there's some justification going on, which again is a higher order assignment and very appropriate for a level 5 student. This activity can be repeated until all students have had a turn. If it turns out that the student has brainstormed and can't discuss or debate, it could be that there's some content that's missing, but it could also be that the student is only giving simple sentences and is not giving the complexity and the number of sentences one would expect in a debate where someone is defending their position, and then you as a teacher would know that some support is needed to either keep the student at a level 5 or move them from a high level 4 to a 5. You would know that this student is perhaps not yet ready to exit the EL program. So let's look at Alpha again. He's our 9th grader at ABC Public Charter School who arrived in the summer from the Ivory Coast but was actually completing studies in Burkina Faso at the Catholic school. It's now January, and the teachers believe Alpha has actually made rapid growth in speaking English. And they feel this way because they've noticed he has an ability to speak in expanded complete sentences. Remember, he was at a level 1.9 on his screener before. And he's now engaging in lengthy conversations, though he still doesn't really speak until he's spoken to. Consequently, Alpha's writing has also improved quite a bit. Knowing what you know now, what are some possible reasons to explain Alpha's progress in speaking? Let's take a moment to think about where he was and where he is now. What are some possible reasons to explain Alpha's progress in speaking? I'll take your thoughts in the question or the chat box. Okay, so I see someone is thinking time. Alpha's just had time in the country and time in the classroom to develop English, which is certainly true. Maybe Alpha's teachers got some professional development, okay, and the content teachers, this could be true. The content teachers might have a better understanding of what speaking is and how to support Alpha's growth in speaking. Thank you for that. Alpha may have become more familiar with words and word order. So yes, this could be an explanation for why he is now speaking in expanded complete sentences and lengthier conversations. One last question for you who are participating. What do you suggest teachers do to foster his continued growth in speaking? Whether this is making sure he continues growing in his ability to speak in expanded complete sentences, or growing in his ability to speak to others rather than waiting to speak until he's spoken to. What do you suggest teachers do to foster his speaking growth? So someone typed in that he should be encouraged to speak up, and expanding on that response, he should be encouraged to speak up, knowing that that's the way we do things in the United States. So maybe there's a cultural piece that needs to be shared with him. Okay, the expanded response is maybe in Catholic school he was told, don't speak until you're spoken to. We weren't there, so we don't know, but that could certainly be the case. It could also be that where he grew up, he was taught not to speak until spoken to. And another suggestion about what teachers can do to foster his growth is to put him in small groups so he can be more comfortable, right, speaking peer-to-peer instead of peer-to-teacher, and that might help him develop his speaking skills. I want to thank you for participating in these question and reflection activities here. Before signing out, as always, there are resources to share, both online, in paper, and through professional development. You'll see the first link on the slide is delivering education services to English learners. This document is useful for all, whether you're an administrator, a teacher, a coach. This document goes into detail about what are the components of an EL program, and it's available for download. We also have a school readiness reflection tool that's at the back of the document above. It goes into detail about what are the components of a well-rounded English learner program, and we are here to offer support in using that tool and understanding how to implement your findings in your setting. We have a new website, and the link is there in the third sentence. Please note that the recording for this presentation will be archived on the website. Aussie's website is undergoing a refresh, as is the EL webpage. So bear with us if you don't see the recordings from this year's presentations immediately. They are forthcoming. As I mentioned, we are here for support when it comes to programming support related to English learners. I'm here at Anika Harris at dc.gov, and our EL program manager is also available at jennifer.norton at dc.gov. There are more events coming up. The next webinar on reading will take place Thursday, March 14th from 1 to 2. The same link you used to connect to this webinar is valid for the next webinar. We also have a new cohort forming for a 4-part series called What Teachers Need to Know About Teaching English Learners. The first session takes place on Thursday, February 28th. One interesting note is if you would like to register, we are currently at waitlist only. We're at capacity. There is still a possibility that anyone who's interested in attending can get a spot. So I would encourage you to register if you're interested, get on the wait list, and let's see how we can keep that moving. If you do have questions about that session, feel free to reach out to us by email. You will be receiving a survey about this webinar along with the webinar slides so that you'll be able to see the links to register for events. Finally, contact information for others who work in EL programming and EL program administration. Michael Craig is going to be your point of contact for the Access for ELLs assessment that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Chandy Wagner assists with data and correcting your data errors, and her email is also provided. Don't forget that there is a handout available to you in the webinar platform on WIDA levels. You can click on the link, download it, print it, or save it to your computer. That's it for today. I look forward to presenting to you on reading next month, Thursday, March 14th at 1 p.m. Have a great rest of the afternoon.